The clinking of silverware against china filled the silence at David's dining room table, a sound that had become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat over the past 8 years. I sat across from my father-in-law, watching him methodically cut his pot roast into perfect squares, the same way he'd done every Sunday since Richard and I got married. The San Diego evening light filtered through his vintage lace curtains, casting long shadows across the mahogany table that had belonged to his late wife, Margaret. I found myself studying the intricate patterns in the wood grain, anything to avoid the uncomfortable quiet that seemed to grow thicker with each passing minute. Richard's empty chair beside me felt like a gaping wound, a constant reminder of how often my husband chose work over family these days. The absence wasn't new, but tonight it felt different somehow, more pointed, as if David's silence carried a weight I couldn't quite understand. David's movements were deliberate and measured, each gesture calculated in a way that made my skin crawl with anticipation. He'd always been a man of few words, preferring action over conversation, but tonight his quietness felt almost aggressive. I watched as he reached for his water glass, his weathered hands steady despite his 72 years, and took a slow sip while his gray eyes remained fixed on something just beyond my shoulder. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked away the seconds with mechanical precision, each sound echoing through the formal dining room like a countdown to something I couldn't name. I shifted in my chair, the leather creaking softly beneath me, and tried to think of something, anything, to break the suffocating silence that had settled between us like a heavy blanket. The smell of his aftershave, Old Spice mixed with something medicinal, reminded me of Sunday dinners from years past when Margaret was still alive and the house felt warm instead of cold. "The roast is delicious, David," I said finally, my voice sounding unnaturally bright in the hushed room. He nodded once, a barely perceptible acknowledgement that did nothing to ease the tension coiling in my stomach like a snake preparing to strike. I took another bite, chewing slowly, tasting nothing but the metallic flavor of my own anxiety. The dining room felt smaller tonight, the walls seeming to press inward with each breath I took, and I found myself wondering why I'd agreed to come alone when Richard canceled at the last minute. Again. The pattern had become so predictable that I'd stopped feeling disappointed and started feeling something else entirely, something that tasted like betrayal and looked like the truth I'd been avoiding for months. David's fork scraped against his plate, a sound that made me wince, and when I looked up, I caught him watching me with an expression I'd never seen before. Something shifted in the air between us, subtle but unmistakable, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the pressure drops and every living thing holds its breath. David set down his fork with deliberate care, the small clink against the china plate sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. His eyes, the same deep brown as Richard's, but somehow more knowing, more tired, met mine across the table with an intensity that made my heart skip a beat. I felt my palms grow damp against my napkin, and a cold dread began to spread through my chest like ice water in my veins. The way he was looking at me reminded me of a doctor preparing to deliver devastating news, or a priest about to offer last rites. There was compassion there, but also a terrible kind of certainty. I wanted to look away, to excuse myself and flee to the safety of my car, but something in his gaze held me frozen in place, waiting for whatever blow was about to fall. The grandfather clock chimed 7:30, its deep, resonant tones filling the room before fading back into oppressive quiet. David reached into his shirt pocket, his movements slow and deliberate, and withdrew a small piece of paper that had been folded into a neat square. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him smooth it out against the table, his fingers trembling slightly, the first sign of vulnerability I'd seen from him all evening. The paper looked old, worn at the edges, as if it had been handled many times, and there was something about the way he held it that made my stomach lurch with a premonition I couldn't name. He looked at me one more time, his expression unreadable, before sliding the note across the polished surface of the table toward my plate. The sound of paper against wood seemed to echo in my ears like a gunshot, and I stared down at the folded square as if it were a live grenade that might explode at any moment. My hands shook as I reached for the note, my fingers feeling clumsy and disconnected from my body. The paper felt warm from David's touch, and I could see my name written on the outside in his careful, old-fashioned handwriting, Barbara, in blue ink that had faded slightly with time. Everything around me seemed to slow down, the ticking of the clock becoming a distant rhythm, the sound of my own breathing unnaturally loud in my ears. I was acutely aware of David watching me, his face grave and patient, waiting for me to open what felt like Pandora's box, sitting innocently on the white tablecloth. The rational part of my mind screamed at me to push the note back across the table, to make some excuse and leave before I learned whatever truth was waiting inside that folded paper. But my curiosity, that fatal flaw that had gotten me into trouble more times than I could count, won out over my fear, and I began to unfold the note with trembling fingers. The words hit me like a physical blow, each letter seeming to burn itself into my retinas as I read the short, devastating message written in David's precise handwriting. My vision blurred at the edges, and I had to grip the edge of the table to keep myself from falling as the full meaning of what I was reading crashed over me like a tsunami. The note contained only 2 sentences, but they were enough to shatter the carefully constructed reality I'd been living in for the past 3 years. My mouth went dry, and I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure David could hear it across the table. The dining room seemed to tilt and spin around me, the familiar furniture and family photos becoming foreign and threatening, as if I'd suddenly found myself in a stranger's house, instead of the place I'd considered a second home for nearly a decade. I looked up at David through eyes that felt like they belonged to someone else, searching his weathered face for some sign that this was all a terrible mistake, a cruel joke, anything but the truth that was now staring me in the face with undeniable clarity. But his expression confirmed what the note had revealed. He knew, had known all along, and had been carrying this burden in silence while I played the role of the devoted wife and daughter-in-law. The weight of his knowledge, of his quiet observation and patient waiting, settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket, and I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The life I thought I'd been living, the marriage I thought I'd been protecting, the family I thought I belonged to, all of it had been built on a foundation of lies that was now crumbling beneath my feet. David reached across the table and gently took my hand, his touch warm and steady, and in that moment I understood that this dinner, this note, this terrible revelation was not the end of my story, but the beginning of something I wasn't sure I was brave enough to face. The note slipped from my fingers and fluttered back onto the table like a dying bird, but the words remained burned into my memory with perfect, horrible clarity. I know about the affair. We need to talk. 7 words that had just demolished 8 years of what I thought was a solid marriage. 7 words that made me question everything I believed about my life, my husband, and myself. I stared at David's weathered face, searching for some hint of malice or satisfaction, but found only a deep sadness that seemed to have settled into the lines around his eyes like permanent shadows. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating, while my mind raced through 1,000 questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. How long had he known? What exactly did he know? And most terrifyingly of all, what did he plan to do with this information that could destroy not just my marriage, but the entire family structure we'd all worked so hard to maintain? David, I started, but my voice cracked like a teenager's, the words dying in my throat before they could form into anything coherent. He held up one weathered hand, a gentle gesture that somehow carried more authority than any shout could have managed, and I fell silent again, waiting for him to speak. The grandfather clock continued its relentless ticking, marking time that felt suspended and eternal all at once, while I sat frozen in my chair like a deer caught in headlights. My mind kept circling back to the same impossible question. How could he possibly know about something I'd worked so hard to hide? Something I'd convinced myself didn't really matter. Something I'd buried so deep I'd almost forgotten it existed. The affair with Marcus had been brief, meaningless, a moment of weakness during one of Richard's many business trips, and I'd ended it before it could become anything more than a terrible mistake I'd have to live with forever. The weight of David's knowledge pressed down on me like a physical force, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to do anything but sit there and feel the walls of my carefully constructed life crumbling around me. I thought about Richard, probably still at his office downtown, completely unaware that his father was confronting his wife about her infidelity over Sunday dinner. The irony wasn't lost on me. Richard's absence, which had driven me to seek comfort elsewhere in the first place, had now left me alone to face the consequences of my actions. I wondered if David had planned it this way, if he'd somehow orchestrated Richard's absence so we could have this conversation without interruption. The thought made me feel sick. The idea that this kind, quiet man I'd grown to love like a father had been plotting and planning, watching and waiting for the right moment to drop this bomb into my life. "How long have you known?" I whispered, my voice barely audible above the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. David's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Pain, maybe, or disappointment, or perhaps just the weariness of carrying a secret that wasn't his to bear. He picked up his water glass and took another slow sip, buying himself time to choose his words carefully, and I realized that this conversation was as difficult for him as it was for me. The man who had welcomed me into his family with open arms, who had treated me like the daughter he'd never had, who had been my rock during Margaret's illness and death, this man now held the power to destroy everything I'd built with his son. The betrayal I felt wasn't just about being caught, but about the realization that someone I trusted and loved had been watching me, judging me, keeping score of my failures as a wife and a woman. 3 months, he said finally, his voice quiet but steady, each word falling into the silence like stones into still water. 3 months. The number hit me like a slap, and I felt my face flush with shame and anger in equal measure. 3 months of family dinners where he'd smiled and made small talk while knowing what I'd done. 3 months of him watching me play the role of the devoted wife while he held the truth like a loaded gun. 3 months of lies and pretense and careful performance, all while he sat in judgment of my choices. I wanted to scream at him, to demand to know why he'd waited so long, why he'd let me continue living in ignorance while he planned this confrontation. But underneath the anger was something worse, the crushing realization that he was right to confront me, that I deserved this moment of reckoning, that I'd brought this pain and humiliation on myself through my own selfish choices. The dining room felt like a courtroom now, with David as both judge and jury, and me as the defendant who had already been found guilty. I could feel the weight of his disappointment settling over me like a shroud, and I understood that this wasn't just about the affair. It was about trust, about family, about the sacred bonds that held people together and the devastating consequences when those bonds were broken. I thought about Margaret, David's beloved wife who had died 2 years ago, and how she would have reacted to this news. She had always been the peacemaker in the family, the one who smoothed over conflicts and kept everyone together, and I felt a fresh wave of shame knowing that I'd betrayed her memory, as well as her son. The empty chair where she used to sit seemed to loom larger now, a silent witness to my failures as a daughter-in-law and a wife. "I hired a private investigator," David continued, his words measured and careful, as if he were diffusing a bomb rather than detonating one. "I suspected something was wrong when Richard started working late so often, when you started seeming distant and distracted during our dinners. I thought maybe he was having an affair, that I needed to protect you from being hurt." The irony in his words was like a knife twisting in my chest. He'd been trying to protect me from Richard's infidelity, only to discover that I was the one who had strayed. I could see the pain in his eyes now, the disappointment of a father who had discovered that the woman he'd welcomed into his family wasn't who he thought she was. The private investigator's report probably contained photos, dates, details of my meetings with Marcus that I'd thought were secret and safe. The violation of privacy felt almost as devastating as the exposure of my guilt. The note lay between us on the table like evidence in a trial, and I found myself staring at it again, memorizing the careful loops and lines of David's handwriting as if they contained some hidden message that might change everything. But there was no escape from the truth, no way to undo what had been done, no magic words that could erase the past 3 months of deception and lies. I was caught, exposed, vulnerable in a way I'd never been before, and the man sitting across from me held my future in his weathered hands. The question now wasn't whether I was guilty. That had been established beyond any doubt. The question was what David planned to do with his knowledge, whether he would use it to destroy my marriage or give me a chance to make things right. As I sat there in the fading San Diego light, surrounded by the ghosts of family dinners past and the wreckage of my carefully constructed lies, I realized that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't even begin to imagine. The silence that followed David's revelation stretched between us like a chasm, filled with all the words we weren't saying and all the truths that hung in the air like smoke. I could feel my hands trembling in my lap, and I clasped them together tightly, trying to regain some semblance of control over my body's betrayal of my emotions. The private investigator's report. I couldn't stop thinking about it, imagining some stranger following me, photographing my most vulnerable moments, documenting my shame for David to review like evidence in a criminal case. The thought made my skin crawl, and I felt exposed in a way that went beyond just being caught in an affair. Someone had been watching me, studying me, cataloging my movements and my mistakes, and now that information sat somewhere in David's house, like a ticking time bomb waiting to explode my entire world. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice stronger now, though my heart was still racing like a trapped bird in my chest. "Why not just tell Richard directly? Why put yourself through this conversation?" The questions tumbled out of me before I could stop them, and I realized that part of me was genuinely curious about David's motivations. He could have simply handed the report to his son and let Richard confront me himself, could have stayed out of the messy, emotional aftermath of my infidelity. Instead, he'd chosen to face me directly, to look me in the eye and deliver this devastating news himself, and there was something almost noble about it, even as it terrified me to my core. "Because I love my son," David said simply, and the words hit me harder than any accusation could have. "And because I love you too, Barbara. You've been like a daughter to me since the day Richard brought you home, and I won't watch this family tear itself apart without trying to find another way." His voice carried a pain that matched my own, and I realized that this conversation was costing him as much as it was costing me. He wasn't enjoying this moment of power over me. He was suffering through it because he believed it was necessary. And the love in his words made my guilt burn even brighter because I understood now that I hadn't just betrayed Richard. I'd betrayed this man who had opened his heart and his home to me. "Richard doesn't know," David continued, his voice gentle but firm. "And he doesn't have to know if you're willing to make some changes." The words hung in the air between us, and I felt a flicker of hope mixed with confusion as I realized he might be offering me a way out, a chance to keep my marriage intact despite my infidelity. The possibility seemed too good to be true, and I found myself leaning forward slightly, desperate to understand what he was proposing. But even as hope bloomed in my chest, I felt a nagging suspicion that David's offer would come with conditions, with prices I might not be willing to pay, because nothing in life was free, especially not forgiveness for the kind of betrayal I'd committed. "You end it completely," David said, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. "No contact, no communication, no closure conversations. You cut all ties with this man and you never see him again." The first condition hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd already ended things with Marcus weeks ago, because the finality in David's voice made it clear that this wasn't a request, but a requirement, non-negotiable and absolute. "You also start marriage counseling with Richard, and you do whatever it takes to rebuild the trust and intimacy in your relationship," he continued, his words stinging because they forced me to confront the truth about my marriage, that I'd been going through the motions for months without really investing in the relationship or working to address the problems that had driven me to seek comfort elsewhere. The weight of David's conditions settled over me like a heavy blanket, and I realized that he was offering me something precious. A second chance, a way to rebuild what I'd damaged without destroying everything in the process. The price was steep: complete honesty, total commitment, and the hard work of rebuilding a marriage that had been slowly crumbling for years. But as I sat there surrounded by the remnants of our family dinner and the weight of my own guilt, I understood it might be the only way to save everything I'd almost thrown away. I thought about Richard, about the man I'd fallen in love with and married, about the dreams we'd shared and the life we'd built together before we'd lost each other in the maze of work and routine and unspoken resentments. David was asking me to find my way back to Richard, to rediscover the love that had brought us together in the first place, and to do the difficult work of rebuilding trust from the ground up. "And if I refuse?" I asked, though I already knew the answer as I looked into David's eyes and saw not just judgment, but also hope. Hope that I would choose the harder path, the path that led back to his son and back to the family I'd almost lost through my own selfish choices. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a hardness that reminded me that beneath his gentle exterior was a man who had fought in Vietnam, who had buried his wife, who had survived losses that would have broken weaker people. He wouldn't hesitate to do what he believed was right, even if it meant destroying his son's marriage in the process. And I understood that this dinner, this conversation, this moment of reckoning was all carefully orchestrated to give me a choice between redemption and destruction. The private investigator's report was still out there, still available to be shared with Richard if I chose not to cooperate with David's plan. And as the grandfather clock chimed 8 o'clock, I realized that my entire future hung in the balance of this single moment. "I'll do it," I said, the words coming out in a rush before I could second-guess myself or find reasons to negotiate. "I'll do whatever you think is necessary to save my marriage." The relief that flooded through me was immediate and overwhelming, as if I'd been holding my breath for months and could finally exhale. And David's expression softened slightly as something that might have been pride flickered in his eyes. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his skin warm and weathered from decades of hard work and honest living. The gesture paternal and protective in a way that made me realize how much I'd missed having someone in my life who cared enough to hold me accountable for my actions. David's intervention, painful as it was, felt like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in their own poor choices. The sound of a car door slamming in the driveway made us both freeze, and I felt my heart leap into my throat as I realized that Richard had come home early from work. David quickly reached across the table and took the note from my trembling fingers, folding it carefully and slipping it back into his shirt pocket while whispering, "Act natural," in a voice that carried decades of experience handling family crises. I tried to compose myself, to wipe the guilt and fear from my expression before my husband walked through the door, knowing that the next few minutes would be a test of my ability to pretend, to play the role of the loving wife while carrying the weight of this life-changing conversation. I heard Richard's key in the lock, heard his familiar footsteps in the hallway, and felt the crushing weight of my new reality settling over me like a shroud. "Sorry I'm late," Richard called out as he entered the dining room, his tie loosened and his hair slightly mussed from a long day at the office, looking tired but genuinely apologetic in a way that made me realize he'd probably been working late to provide for our future while I'd been betraying everything we'd built together. He kissed the top of my head as he passed behind my chair, a casual gesture of affection that made my eyes sting with unshed tears because I could see the love and trust in his eyes, the complete faith he had in me and in our marriage. "How was dinner? Did Dad bore you with more stories about his Navy days?" he asked with an easy smile and familiar teasing that felt like a knife in my heart. That trust was about to be tested in ways he couldn't imagine, and I prayed that I would be strong enough to prove worthy of it. As I looked up at my husband's face, I made a silent promise to myself and to David. I would do whatever it took to save my marriage, to become the wife Richard deserved, and to earn back the trust I'd so carelessly thrown away. The weight of David's knowledge would always be there, a constant reminder of how close I'd come to losing everything, but it would also serve as motivation to be better, to work harder, to never again take for granted the love of the man who had chosen to spend his life with me. Everything had changed in the space of 2 hours, but I would have to pretend that nothing was different, that I was still the same woman who had sat down to dinner with her father-in-law earlier that evening. The real work would begin tomorrow, when I would have to find the courage to suggest marriage counseling without revealing why it was so desperately needed. But tonight, I would simply hold on to my husband and be grateful for the second chance I'd been given.